All right, class, let's pick back up with some more operant conditioning work. So first I want to bring you back to some more YouTube videos. So now we're going to start getting into the realm of shaping and things that you can train. So here's just a little bit to kind of engage your imagination.
The two pigeons are at either end of a small ping pong table. One pigeon pecks the ball as it comes toward him and knocks it toward the other pigeon. Other pigeon pecks the ball back across the table. If it goes past one pigeon, the other pigeon can eat, and if it goes the other way, the other pigeon eats. So that there is it's a real game. The pigeon is reinforced for a cross-court shot if that is what gets the ball past his opponent.
So this is just to highlight some of the different kinds of things that could potentially be done as part of a shaping project. Excuse me. And some ideas in there. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. All right, so one of the questions that I typically get at these points at these lectures is the comparison again of operant versus Pavlovian conditioning. So here's a quick little comparison contrast. So Pavlovian conditioning is about modifying reflex behavior. So remember that unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, reflex is going to be an important component of Pavlovian conditioning. And it's an association between two stimuli, the conditioned stimulus, like a bell, and the unconditioned stimulus, like a food. So it's an association of bell, food, bell, food. Operant conditioning is about how your behavior gets associated with something like food. So how your ability to put money into a snack machine gets food, or your ability to cook food gets food, or your ability to ask for food gets food. All of these are operant behaviors because it's how your behavior gets you that item. Whereas in Pavlovian conditioning, it's about an association between two stimuli, like whether seeing a bell means food will come, seeing McDonald's arches means food will come, kind of thing. So you have no control in terms of your training or shaping over the conditioned response. This is a biologically prepared response because it sort of depends on that reflexive response, whatever that may happen to be. In operant conditioning, you can basically modify any possible behavior within an animal's sort of physical capability or cognitive capability. This is sort of in the emitted or voluntary behavior realm. So anything that the organism can do is something that could potentially be modified through operant conditioning. It associates a particular behavior with a consequence. So behavior leads to a reinforcer or a punisher. And there's significant control over the form and shape of the behavior, meaning that you can, not just train a dog to go through a door, but you can train them to go through a door a specific way, or however it is that you like. You have very strong control over each individual aspect of that behavior. All right, so let's go into a quick little video on shaping. Oops.
Free shaping tips.
Free shaping, go under.
Free shaping simply means clicking approximations of a behavior to achieve the final result without giving the dog any verbal or visual cues. A tip for free shaping crawl under is to use an object that the dog can freely walk under first before raising criteria where the dog has to crawl under the object. A very good tip for using free shaping is to only have the object that you're using in the room with the dog. If there are other objects around the dog can get distracted and confused as to which object you want the dog to work with. As your dog succeeds, make it harder, so make the object lower and lower. Give a hint, then free shape. Here's a trick I use to speed up the training process when you need a behavior very quickly. First, use luring to get the behavior about 10 times and then sit back and see if the dog can offer the behavior you just lured. Remember to click the dog for the motion of crawling under the object. This is Trisha's first lesson with this behavior, and as you can see, she's already started offering the behavior on her own, and we can add a verbal cue.
Go under. Good girl. Trish, go under. Good job. Trish, go under. Good girl. Trish, go under. Good girl. You're smart.
Don't forget to subscribe to channel Kikopup.
If you're trying to lose.
All right, so shaping. How can you teach a new behavior? And one of the sort of primary ways to do this is going to be through shaping. So when you do that, essentially what you need to do is identify the behavior that you want to train. So in the video examples, I was going underneath a chair, or a stool, I guess would probably be a better way of saying it. Going under the stool, and then essentially what you want to do is you want to break that down and find sort of the closest behavior the subject already produces. So one of those would just simply be going up and touching the chair, or just simply looking at the chair. Anything that's already within the sort of the scope of what the animal already does. Let's get that to appear, sorry. And then start reinforcing that. And then once you reinforce that, you'll get that sort of behavior going further. You essentially start repeating. So shaping by definition is what we say, successive or reinforcement of successive approximations, meaning that every time you reinforce a behavior that you're looking for, you sort of build that behavior, then you wait and start reinforcing the next closest behavior to what it is that you want to do. So if it's going under a chair, you can initially reinforce just simply looking at the chair, then reinforce approaching up to the chair, then reinforcing put a little bit of your head underneath the chair, then a little bit more of your head underneath the chair, then a little bit more of your head underneath the chair, a little bit more of your head underneath the chair until you go all the way through the chair. So shaping is all about reinforcing successive approximations, getting closer and closer and closer. So your first kind of in-person-ish activity is going to be conducting a little shaping project. So you're going to think about something within your group of what it is that you want to train your dog to do. So we're not going to be doing this for a couple more weeks because we have to wait on a couple more sort of final approvals to be able to allow it. But once I get those, I'll then set the dates for that. But I want you to start thinking with your group as well, what might be something that you would want to shape your dog to do. Remember, you'll have a 30-minute period of time, so obviously you won't be shaping them to do the Gettysburg Address or anything, particularly complicated. But in the past, we've had students successful with a variety of things, whether it be weaving cones, going in, standing on top of a chair. For some reason, people love to have the dog sit in a chair. Another one was playing soccer. They rolled the ball to a goal. Another one was, I'm trying to think of some of the other cute ones were. I think picking something up and putting it in a bucket. That one was a little bit harder, but they got it most of the way there. But anyway, so something to think about for your potential group to do for this shaping assignment. So take home points for today. I want you to identify what is a discriminative stimulus in an establishing operation. Can you identify the difference between the two of them? And what is the relationship between a discriminative stimulus and a conditioned stimulus? Then we'll talk about what is the Premack principle, how can you apply it, and then ultimately what is shaping, which we've already just covered for the most part. All right, so what is a discriminative stimulus? A discriminative stimulus are basically stimuli that precede behavior. So they come before a behavior. Initially, they're neutral. So this is starting to sound like a conditioned stimulus, right? but they acquire behavioral importance by accompanying behavior consequence relationships, meaning that they come to a point in which they are associated or indicative that a particular behavior will get reinforced. So that means that they signal whether reinforcement will be presented following a specific behavior. So a simple example is when you say sit, that means that if your dog were to sit right then, reinforcement was going to be available. So it's anything that kind of cues what behavior is going to be reinforced at a particular time. So like whether if a light is green, that indicates that you'll be reinforced for proceeding ahead and going to the intersection. If a light is red, that indicates you'll be reinforced for stopping by not getting into a car accident. So we like to break behavior down into what we call a three-term contingency. And what we mean by that is that there are three important components. There is a discriminative stimulus, a behavior, and a consequence. So the discriminative stimulus is referred to here as the SD. Behavior is the behavior of the individual, and then consequence is a consequence of that behavior. So a simple example is that if you're into microwave popcorn, you can hear the sound wave of the pop, 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 and a discriminative stimulus to know when to open the microwave and immediately take the popcorn out, because you're a pro at this, is when you hear the change from pop, 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 pop to pop, pop, pop. Hopefully most of you have taken the popcorn out by now. Otherwise, you've probably completely ruined it. But nonetheless, that is a discriminative stimulus to indicate that if you then remove the popcorn right then and there, you will be rewarded with absolutely delicious and non-burnt popcorn. So the discriminative stimulus is the sound of the popping. Behavior is opening of the microwave and pulling out your popcorn. And the consequence is yummy, delicious popcorn. In terms of our dog training, this can look like your SD of saying lay down, your dog laying down, and then getting the consequence of a nice, yummy bone. There are a variety of discriminative stimuli. You have discriminative stimuli all around you, and they're controlling your behavior at every moment, whether you realize it or not. So for example, one potential is your like-minded friends might be a discriminative stimulus for talking about politics, whereas your less like-minded friends might be what we call an S delta or an extinction stimulus to indicate not to talk about politics around them. The tests sort of listed on the syllabus is a discriminative stimulus for studying. So the test date is a cue that indicates that if you study before then, you'll be reinforced. We already talked about a red light as a discriminative stimulus for stopping. A football game could be a discriminative stimulus for yelling about Go Gators or Red Raiders for you guys, but I'm still a Floridian from my early days. Favorite authors on the cover of a particular book could be a discriminative stimulus for reading that book. And a store checkout could be a discriminative stimulus for paying money for an item. So pretty much everything that you're doing is controlled by, to some degree, discriminative stimuli that tell you what will be reinforcing at a particular time and what will not be reinforcing at a particular time. The way we talk about this is we say that discriminative stimuli set the occasion for behavior. They do not elicit it in the same way that our Pavlovian conditioned responses elicit reflexes, but it sets the occasion. It makes it more likely because it's indicative that reinforcement is going to be available. We also have something similar, but we call an S delta, which is a stimulus under which behavior is not going to be reinforced. So typically an S delta indicates that if you do this behavior, it won't be reinforced. It would be like an exit sign, or not an exit sign, a closed sign at a store that you want to go into will indicate that that store is not available. Or any kind of stimulus that indicates that reinforcement is not going to be available, like the ovens being turned off or someone sort of showing an angry face when you ask them about dinner. All of those kinds of things are going to be like discriminative stimuli, but instead of indicating that reinforcement is going to be likely, they're indicating that reinforcement is going to be less likely. Then comes the question, can a discriminative stimulus be a conditioned stimulus? And we've already talked about some of the inherent similarities between discriminative stimuli and conditioned stimuli. One of the major differences, however, though, remember, is that conditioned stimuli is through Pavlovian conditioning and comes to elicit a reflex response, whereas discriminative stimuli set the occasion for operant behavior. However, there are a lot of similarities in there. So let's think of a simple behavioral kind of episode where you have a young puppy crazy dog who is coming at you, and you say, bad dog, sit. And then the dog sits very nicely. And you say, oh, good boy. And then you give them a treat. And then they salivate, so to bring back our Pavlovian conditioning. So we can break this down into a variety of chunks. And here, the obvious behavior is the dog sitting. The discriminative stimulus is going to be you saying, bad dog, sit, right? Or generally saying sit. Doesn't necessarily even have to be a bad dog. You can just say sit. Dog sits. You say, good boy, or you could use a clicker here, and then you provide a treat, and then the dog salivates. So from Pavlovian conditioning and what we've talked about already, I hope that you would recognize that right inside of this operant scenario, you already have Pavlovian conditioning going on. This good boy or clicker, we already talked about clicker training as being a form of Pavlovian conditioning. This good boy or a click is associated with food, such that the click will come to produce a conditioned positive emotional response, right? Because it's associated with food and salivation. However, remember we talked about sort of second order conditioning or other types of conditioning. And what's going to happen is that this stimulus here is also going to pick up conditioning power. This will become conditioned stimulus 2 with its association with conditioned stimulus 1, and ultimately the unconditioned stimulus. So our second discriminative stimulus here, or our discriminative stimulus, can also become a secondary conditioned stimulus. And it's actually quite common that discriminative stimuli will show Pavlovian kind of conditioned responses, and we'll pick up positive kind of emotional conditioned responses, just like we would if it was a regular conditioned stimulus. All right, so to change gears just a little bit now, we can talk about establishing operations. So establishing operations ultimately revolve around what we call motivation or motivating operations. So as we were talking about all of our operant behavior and different consequences, as you can imagine, the effects of different consequences are going to depend on your motivation for those consequences. So if the reinforcer is going to be, like one blueberry, that's probably not going to get you to do a lot of work. However, if the reinforcer was a year of free food or something like that, right? People will do ridiculous things. People do ridiculous things for a free pizza. People do ridiculous things for a free t-shirt that's shot out of a cannon. And really what depends on the amount of behavior and to what degree changes of behavior occur is going to depend on how motivating or reinforcing a particular stimulus is. There are some ways to control how reinforcing and motivating a stimulus is, and that's what we call an establishing operation. It's a change in the environment that alters the effectiveness of some stimulus or event as a reinforcer and simultaneously alters the momentary frequency of that behavior that has been followed by that reinforcer. So what we mean by that is that we make something more reinforcing, and then we make behavior more likely to occur that has previously produced that reinforcer. So EOs have two major effects, establishing operations being EOs. They increase the momentary effectiveness of reinforcement, and they increase behaviors that have produced that in the past. So if you have deprivation from food, then food can become a more effective reinforcer, and it becomes more likely that behaviors that have been reinforced in the past to occur. If you have a very hot day, then water might become a more effective reinforcer, and that means that you're going to be reinforcing, or behaviors that have been reinforced by water in the past are going to become more likely to occur. If you have a New York City blackout, then light becomes a more effective reinforcer because you don't have it anymore. And behaviors that have produced light in the past, like lighting a candle or turning on a flashlight, are going to become more likely to occur. So you're a hungry dog, food becomes a more effective reinforcer, and the behaviors that have led to you feeding them may become more likely, like barking, begging, sitting down in front of you and staring at you, any of those kinds of things. Oops. So how do establishing operations and discriminative stimuli relate? A lot of times they can be confused with one another, but there are important differences. Discriminative stimuli predict the availability of reinforcers. They tell you whether a reinforcer is available or not, but it doesn't actually change how valuable that reinforcer will be. It just tells you that you will get food if you do this, or you won't get food if you do this. Whereas an EO makes that food more interesting. So EOs make those reinforcers valuable, and they make those consequences function as reinforcers. So now we can sort of explain why you don't necessarily stop at McDonald's every time you see the golden arches, right? Every time you see a McDonald's sign, that is a SD, or discriminative stimulus, to tell you that if you were to stop and talk into a little microphone and then hand over some money, you will be reinforced with food, which is just an operant chain behavior. But that doesn't mean that you're going to do that every time you see that. Every time you see the arches, you're not going to be, let me pull in and do this. Maybe some of you do, maybe some of you don't. But nonetheless, the reason why you're not doing it all the time is because you're not motivated to do it all the time. You don't have the establishing operation in effect to do that. If you wanted to create an establishing operation to motivate you to do that, one way would be to deprive you of McDonald's for the next year, such that probably the next time you see a McDonald's, it might be more encouraging. Another is to make you very, very hungry, and then to make McDonald's the only thing that is around, right? So if you want food, this is your option. And if that's the case, then you might go through the McDonald's and know that if you go to the McDonald's drive-through, talk in the little microphone thingy, put in your little money give your money to the person, then you then get the food that will then alleviate your hunger. So not only do you have to be hungry, but also previously deprived of McDonald's or some kind of other balance thereof. So the arches just simply tell you that you could get your reinforcer of food by engaging in a specific chain of behavior, but it's your establishing operations that actually make you want to do it. So not feeding your dog before taking it to obedience class, only allowing your child to watch TV after completing homework and not the other times, or nagging your significant other to clean the dishes until he or she complies. These are all going to be ways to establish motivation to engage in a particular behavior, but don't necessarily act as a discriminative stimulus. So within other topics of operant conditioning, one of the important ones is going to be the Premack principle. So the Premack principle is basically a way of looking at, well, what is reinforcing under what particular times? And then shaping, which we've already talked about. And then lastly, another kind of just generally interesting question is, do you need to be consciously aware for learning to occur? So the Premack principle addresses the question of what stimuli will be reinforcers in what context. When it comes to reinforcers, the only way to be 100% sure whether a particular reinforcer or a particular stimulus will be a reinforcer or not is to essentially make it contingent on something and see if behavior goes up. So it's functional, to actually do the experiment and see, does this work as a reinforcer? However, that can be a lot of work, and sometimes it's useful to be able to predict what might serve as a reinforcer for an individual versus another. So the Premack principle helps us do that. And what the Premack principle states is that it assumes that reinforcers are actually being able to engage in certain behaviors rather than necessarily the stimuli. So being able to engage in eating, not necessarily the food, is what is the reinforcing property. So things like running can be reinforcing. Things like exercise could be reinforcing. Things like playing on your iPad. It's not the iPad per se, but it's the playing on the iPad that is reinforcing, or the playing on your computer or playing on your phone. And the way to determine what is potentially reinforcing for another thing is essentially to determine the probability of several behaviors. So essentially look at, well, what is it that you do? And your more probable behaviors will reinforce less probable behaviors. So an example is that it might be more probable that a child will eat ice cream than Brussels sprouts. So we can reinforce eating Brussels sprouts, get them to eat more Brussels sprouts, by allowing the child to eat ice cream if they eat more Brussels sprouts. However, it's unlikely that you'll get it the other way around. In other words, you won't be able to get them to eat more ice cream if you say, if you take another bite of ice cream, I'm going to give you Brussels sprouts. That's unlikely to engender more ice cream eating. Whereas if you were to say, if you take one more bite of Brussels sprouts, I will give you ice cream. And this has been shown both in humans, but also in rodents, and looking at how reinforcing properties of different things can be dependent on our current sort of state. So if you have a rat that was deprived of drinking, then the most probable response for them will be to engage in drinking. If they were deprived of being able to run on their wheel by putting a brake on it, then their most probable excuse me, their most probable response when you remove the brake is to run. And then you can do a reinforcement test to see what reinforces what. So in other words, can drinking reinforce running? So in other words, if drinking is now the most probable behavior, will that get them to run so that they can access drinking? Or can you get them to drink so that they can access running? And the answer is basically you can get them to run to get access to drinking, but it's hard to get them the other way around, to drink more to get them to be allowed to run. However, if they'd been deprived from running, you basically get the opposite results. The conclusion is that more probable behaviors can reinforce less probable behaviors, and the probability of certain behaviors can depend on your relative state of deprivation of each of those behaviors. So an example within dog training of where we might have this Premack principle is that if your dog is a particularly sort of into sniffing on the ground and going investigating things, that is their more probable behavior, and they're very unlikely to walk next to you. You can use sniffing on the ground as a reinforcer for them to walk next to you nicely. So if they're walking, if they are going on a walk, if they engage walking nicely next to you for a certain period of time, you can then allow them to sniff on the ground and go and explore. And then this will serve as a way to reinforce loose leash walking. So if you arrange the most probable or sniffing on the ground contingent on walking next to you, then the least probable behavior, walking next to you, will start to increase. So this is an application of the Premack principle to be able to identify a behavior that is potentially reinforcing and then apply that to increase certain behaviors. So you could think about this for yourself. If you could think about, well, what is your phone time, your screen time, look at your iPhone and see how much of you have screen times greater than 3 hours, and then consider how much of your day do you spend studying. If you say have a screen time of 4 hours and you study for 2 hours a day, then this would suggest that if you wanted to increase your studying, you can make your screen time contingent on studying. So to be able to access your phone or to unlock your phone, you've got to study for 10 or 15 minutes. That suggests that that would actually increase your screen time, or sorry, your studying time. However, that means that you wouldn't be able to do the reverse. In other words, you wouldn't be able to say, just work on your screen for another 10 minutes, and once you're on your screen for another 10 minutes, then you get to study for 10 minutes. That's not going to make you start looking at your screen more, but it might get you to study more if it's the opposite way around. Another interesting question is that, do we need to be conscious or consciously aware of what we're learning to be able to learn? Can we learn even if we can't even report what we have learned or what's going on? And the answer is, interestingly, no, you don't have to be aware at all. So in this study, they used differential reinforcement of very small scale operants. They used an EMG to record thumb twitches, so very minor, small movements of your thumb. The participants were given very minimal instructions and told it was a study on relaxation. And just there would be a light panel that was worth 5 cents every time they got an extra little light box on their light panel, so that they were being reinforced in 5-second increments. And it was an ABA design. So they had a baseline, a reinforcement period, and an extinction period. And essentially what they found is that you can get substantial increases in those little minor thumb twitches if you're reinforcing them, even though the participants could not understand how they were getting the reinforcement or how they were getting sort of their 5-second or 5-cent increments. They were able to still be able to produce that behavior to increase their amount of money, even though they couldn't tell you how they were doing it. And then when the extinction phase kicked in, you saw that behavior decrease again, even though they could not tell you what was controlling sort of the movement of or the increment of their 5 cent intervals. And you can do this with a variety of kind of physiological responses, such as blood pressure, eye movements, and overall kinds of just very subtle behavioral movements. And this can be completely unconscious, so you cannot necessarily even verbally describe it, but you can do it. So reinforcement and punishment is happening all of the time, even if we aren't aware of it. This becomes particularly important within our social context, right? If you talk to someone and they give you kind of a rude response, you may not be thinking of, oh man, I've been operantly conditioned through punishment to not ask that question again. But it is happening. You may not be aware of it, but it is happening, and your behavior is always being operantly conditioned. And the same as with the animals, whether you mean to be conditioning them or not, they're constantly being operantly conditioned, sometimes in a way that you like, sometimes in a way that you don't like, but operant conditioning has no impact or caring as to whether you mean to or not. So even individuals that have been in a coma or a vegetative state have been shown to engage or to learn and engage in operant behaviors with certain types of reinforcers. So in this experiment, they used music that was contingent on small little head movements. And the baseline condition is when they weren't doing anything. And then the experimental condition is when they were providing brief periods of music if they were to move their head or to engage in eye focus. And what you could see is when they made music contingent on moving the head, they saw increases in head movement. And then when they added moving the eyes, they saw increases in eye movement, suggested that even an individual that was in a coma are still able to be operantly conditioned. And we are able to be operantly conditioned even when we're not sort of verbally aware of what is going on. So just like Pavlovian conditioning, operant conditioning is happening all the time. It's all the way going, whether we mean it or not. Operant conditioning is about sort of emitted or voluntary behavior. Reinforcers increase the probability of behavior while punishers decrease it. We have a positive and negative distinction. That means whether you add or take away something, not whether something is good or bad. And our definitions of whether something is a reinforcer or punisher are based on function. Do they increase behavior or decrease behavior? Not necessarily on form. You can't just say cheese is a reinforcer. Well, it might be for some people, but not for other people. It's basically defined as, does it increase behavior or does it decrease behavior? Discriminative stimuli signal the availability of reinforcers, and establishing operations make reinforcers more effective. And remember, the Premack principle shows that higher rate behaviors that we engage in can reinforce lower rate behaviors, and that shaping is a way to establish new behaviors through reinforcing successive approximations of a target behavior. All right, that wraps up this chunk for this week, and we'll see you soon.